Hola, hola, muy buenas tardes. Les damos la bienvenida a una nueva y especial cátedra abierta en homenaje a Roberto Bolaño UDP. Estamos muy contentos, muy felices de poder realizar esta cátedra y contar nada más y nada menos con una escritora a quien admiramos muchísimo. Yo sé que acá en Chile tienen muchos lectores y desde hace mucho tiempo que queríamos contar con ella y ahora sí se dio la posibilidad. Estamos muy felices de estar junto a Vivian Gornick eh, y también junto a Evelyn Erlij, que nos acompañará hoy día y va a presentarla y nos va a ayudar también ahí a conversar con Vivian, quien hoy día dictará una conferencia que sé que les va a gustar mucho, un capítulo de su último libro, un capítulo dedicado a Natalia Ginsburg, otra escritora que en Chile tiene muchos lectores, así que sé que lo van a disfrutar. Quiero hacer unas presentaciones muy breves, porque sé que lo que importa es escuchar a Evelyn y a Vivian. Vivian Gornick nació en Nueva York en el año 1935, y creo que a muchos de los lectores en español se nos apareció cuando se tradujo Apegos Feroces. Sexto Piso lo tradujo hace un par de años. Un libro impresionante. Yo recuerdo haberme comprado el libro solo por la contratapa, que es una cosa que uno suele no hacer, ¿no? Y es un peligro, ¿no? Pero la contratapa era tan contundente, y yo en ese momento no sabía quién era Vivian Gornick, recién se había publicado solo ese libro en castellano de ella. Y nada, son unas memorias impresionantes, que han tenido un éxito además en España y en Latinoamérica muy grande, y que ha hecho también que Sexto Piso haya empezado a traducir toda su obra, ¿no? Lo que obviamente ha sido muy reconocido por los lectores. Después de Apegos Feroces se tradujo también La Mujer Singular y la Ciudad, Mirarse de Frente, y el último libro que acaba de salir en España y que va a llegar a Chile probablemente en un par de meses, es Cuentas Pendientes, que son los textos más literarios, más de crítica literaria de Vivian, y son realmente extraordinarios. O sea, no solo era una gran narradora autobiográfica, sino que además es una lectora impresionante, así que nada, estamos muy contentos de estar con ella, y hoy día, como les decía, va a presentarla a Evelyn Erlij, periodista, editora de la revista Palabra Pública, quien muy gentilmente nos aceptó esta invitación de presentar a Vivian y poder conversar con ella. Así que nada, Evelyn, te dejo la palabra a ti para que leas tu presentación, y luego escucharemos a Vivian.
Muchas gracias, Diego, y bueno, buenas tardes. Quiero empezar dando las gracias por esta invitación a la cátedra en homenaje a Roberto Bolaño. Quería también agradecer a Marcela Aguilar, directora ejecutiva de la cátedra y decana de la Facultad de Comunicación y Letras de la Universidad Diego Portales, a ti, Diego Zúñiga, coordinador general, y a Vivian Gornick por haber aceptado esta invitación. Mi presentación se divide en 3 partes y comienza así. 1. La primera vez que escuché el nombre de Vivian Gornick fue cuando un editor con muy buen ojo literario me pasó un ejemplar de Apegos Feroces para que escribiera algo en los albores del Me Too. Lo devoré en una tarde y publiqué un artículo sobre siglos de frustración encarnados en esas señoras cascarrabias que todos tenemos en el árbol genealógico. Pensé en la abuela de Gornick, que pasó 20 años embarazada. Pensé en Bess, su madre, una mujer brillante que se arrepintió para siempre de la vida doméstica que llevó. Pensé en mi bisabuela paterna, que decía regañadientes que el amor llega después del matrimonio, y en mi bisabuela materna, que se casó a los 15 años con un viejo al que sobrevivió por 3 décadas. Sobre todo, pensé en su hija, mi abuela, y en todas las mujeres hoscas que, como ella, pasaron sus días ancladas en los pocos metros cuadrados de una cocina. Recordé su risa quejumbrosa, que nunca pude distinguir de su llanto. Me acordé de los palmazos, los gritos, el miedo. Por primera vez sentí pena por ella en vez de rabia. Si Apegos Feroces se convirtió en un clásico contemporáneo, no es porque sea un relato honesto, un adjetivo muy poco literario por lo demás, sino porque nos enfrenta al amor más enfermizo de todos, a esa suerte de sumisión visceral, atávica hacia nuestras madres, y ante todo nos lanza a la cara una verdad terrible, que a través de ellas casi todos conocemos por primera vez el amor, la decepción, el poder y la ternura, como decía Adrienne Rich. Pensaba que el libro iba sobre cómo me convertí en mujer, pero realmente de lo que trata es de lo que no podía dejar a mi madre porque yo me había convertido en mi madre, explicó Gornick alguna vez. Publicamos la nota y después de unos días el editor me pidió el libro de vuelta. Ah, era prestado, respondí con una risita nerviosa, mientras pensaba en el estado impresentable en que lo había dejado, lleno de rayas, destacados y muchos signos de exclamación. Así se leen, imagino, esos libros que parecen estar escritos especialmente para una sensación que menciono porque sé que Vivian Gornick, lectora crónica y apasionada, conoce muy bien. A mi jefe no le quedó otra que regalarme su copia, y aunque no volví a abrir el libro en un par de años, guardé en la memoria esta frase. La infelicidad tiene que estar viva para que pueda suceder cualquier cosa. La historia de las revoluciones, de los feminismos, de la humanidad entera podría explicarse con esa cita, pero también la de los pequeños triunfos personales. Pensé que las mujeres libres de hoy, o las que nos suponemos libres, somos fruto de la infelicidad, o mejor dicho, somos el último eslabón, pero no el final, de una cadena de desdicha que se extiende al infinito hacia el pasado. El feminismo, en otras palabras, es una forma de rehabitar el pasado. Vivian Gornick me enseñó algo que después aprendí con Simone Weil, que nunca nos sacan de la cueva, salimos de ella. 2. En Cuentas pendientes, el último libro de Vivian Gornick traducido al castellano, la autora cuenta que cuando era niña, su madre reprocharle que no tenía corazón, que cualquier día la iba a matar de la rabia. Vas a acabar conmigo, reclamaba con los ojos y puños apretados. En una ocasión, dice, el enojo fue tal que para castigarla le cortó un pedazo del vestido que usaría para el cumpleaños de una amiga. Pasé una semana llorando y 50 años lamentándome por el incidente, confiesa Gornick, que no dejó de preguntarle toda la vida cómo pudo hacerle eso a una niña. La anécdota es hermosa porque luego, y después de mucha insistencia de su madre, se dio cuenta de que era un recuerdo totalmente inventado. ¿Cuántos traumas se sostienen en recuerdos falsos? ¿Cuántas barbaridades se cometen en nombre de esas ficciones con las que justificamos nuestras fallas? Este año he estado en 2 talleres literarios que los 2 hemos tenido que leer libros de Vivian Gornick. ¿Por qué? Me lo pregunté hace poco mientras se nos iba la vida discutiendo con mis compañeros algunos de los ensayos de su libro Mirarse de frente, en los que se para frente a un espejo imaginario y divaga desde su experiencia en torno a la soledad, a la farsa del amor romántico o a la forma en que dejamos morir la escritura de cartas. Comentábamos que para Gornick no existen las palabras sagradas, que bajo su escritura demoledora hasta el feminismo se convierte en un terreno pantanoso. Al día siguiente, la escritora que nos guía y nos da las lecturas tuiteó: ayer leímos los ensayos de Gornick y decíamos qué hermoso cómo historiza su pensamiento, sus cambios de opinión, algo que ni de lejos nadie se permite en Twitter. Los ensayos reunidos en Cuentas pendientes son un buen ejemplo. En ello vuelve a libros que la marcaron en algún punto de su vida y que ahora relee con la lucidez que le ha dado el tiempo, un ejercicio en el que no solo descubre nuevas lecturas e interpretaciones. Gornick reabre textos viejos de su biblioteca y discute con lo que subrayó y con lo que no, con lo que vio y lo que pasó por alto. Se enfrenta y debate con la mujer que fue, con la veinteañera que le prendía velas a Colette, con la universitaria que miró en menos a Joseph Lloyd Carr, porque no estaba de humor para comprenderlo, o con la joven que estaba segura de que jamás escribiría gran literatura hasta que llegó a Natalia Ginsburg, una de las escritoras que más la han marcado. En esas mismas páginas, Gornick confiesa que una de las lecciones que aprendió leyéndola es que una nunca deja de ser una extraña para sí misma. Lo dice a sus 80 y tantos años, cuando la vida ya le enseñó más de alguna lección, y en un mundo en que el exceso de confianza en sí misma es una virtud y una necesidad. Cuando le preguntan por los judíos su escritura, cosa que hacen todo el tiempo, yo respondería con este chiste: un judío jamás está de acuerdo no solo con no judíos, ni con otros judíos, sino tampoco consigo mismo. En estos tiempos en que la prensa y las redes sociales están pobladas de predicadores de certezas, en que la identidad es una coraza cada vez más rígida, imagino que leemos a Vivian Gornick con tantas ganas porque nos recuerda que ser humano es ser falible, errático, voluble, que dudar y cambiar de opinión es una virtud, un deber, una necesidad para que pueda suceder cualquier cosa, para que pueda suceder la literatura sin ir más lejos. 3. Alguna vez leí en un manifiesto del colectivo feminista Guerrilla Girls que una de las ventajas de ser una artista mujer es saber que tu carrera puede repuntar cumplido los 80 años. Las 3 décadas que pasaron para que Apegos Feroces fuera traducido al castellano desde que se publicó en inglés en 1987 son una prueba. Así de lento avanza el tiempo para las mujeres. Tuvimos que esperar hasta la 4ª ola para que nos llegara un tesoro de la segunda. Y aprovecho de preguntar, ¿por qué nadie la interroga sobre lo que significaba para una mujer ensayista como ella aferrarse a la primera persona en los años 70, en un mundo intelectual predominantemente masculino que miraba con sospecha cualquier asomo de inteligencia en una mujer? ¿Por qué cuesta tanto poner las cosas en contexto? Leo entrevistas que le han hecho en el último tiempo y veo que rara vez le preguntan por literatura, tanto como por escritores cancelados, por las protestas feministas de hoy, o si acaso es verdad que su madre la presentaba diciendo: esta es mi hija, me odia. Cuando le piden hablar sobre el feminismo de la cuarta ola, ella suele responder: nosotras reclamamos lo mismo hace 40 años. Y pienso en algo que dijo hace poco Martha Rosler, artista contemporánea a Gornick, que este presentismo, este afán por reinterpretar el pasado desde el presente no permite combatir los contragolpes de la historia, que sin el pasado estamos mal equipados para el futuro. Llámenme ingenua, pero soy de las que piensa que el futuro sería un mejor lugar si se leyera más y mejor a Vivian Gornick. Reducir su obra al feminismo o a la escritura autobiográfica es quedarse en la chimuchina de la contingencia y del relato confesional. Los sentimientos no son el tema, la experiencia tampoco. Todo es material crudo al que hay que darle forma. Le enseña a sus estudiantes, a los que nunca se cansa de decirles que no se trata sobre uno, sino sobre literatura, sobre leer, releer y releerse tanto como escribir. Vivian Gornick escribe desde sí misma, no tanto para entenderse como para entendernos. Me uso como un instrumento de iluminación, ha dicho ella, y esos son sus libros, faros en medio de la oscuridad de estos tiempos, recordatorios de que nunca dejamos de ser unos desconocidos para nosotros mismos, de que moriremos llenos de cuentas pendientes, de que escribir es al mismo tiempo una excursión hacia adentro y hacia afuera de la propia vida, como dijo alguna vez Lori Moore. Wayne Kostenbaum escribió que cometemos una crueldad contra la existencia si no la interpretamos a muerte. En ese intento diría, y no quiero sonar dramática, pero ¿qué más da? Vivian Gornick ha dado su vida como escritora. Gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Evelyn, por esa súper presentación.
Yes.
Dear Vivian, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And now we want to hear you read
Okay.
your conference.
Right. I'm glad that you like Natalia Ginsburg as much as I do. And I'm really happy to read about her. So one of the chapters in this book of mine, Unfinished Business, the notes of a chronic rereader, is on the great Italian writer, Natalia Ginsburg. Tolstoy once said, if he was asked to write on social or political questions, he would not waste one word on the subject. But if asked to write a book, which 20 years from the time it was written would make people laugh and cry and love life more, to this he would bend all his efforts. A writer whose work has often made me love life more is Natalia Ginsburg. Reading her, as I have repeatedly over many years, I experience the exhilaration that comes with being intellectually reminded that one is a sentient being. First time around, my eyes were opened to something important about who I was at the moment of reading, later to who I was becoming. But then I lived long enough to feel a stranger to myself. No one more surprised than me that I turned out to be who I am. And reading Ginsburg again has provided solace as well as revelation. When I was 10 years old, the teacher held a composition of mine up before the class and said, this little girl is going to be a writer. I don't think I'd ever heard the word writer before, and I certainly didn't know what it meant. But I remember that I felt warm and happy hearing it applied to myself. Even then, I knew that what had so absorbed me when I was writing my composition, that is, sitting with a pen in my hand, thinking about how to best arrange the words on the piece of paper in front of me, had given me something I'd never had before, a thrill. When the teacher praised what I had written, I felt the thrill again and resolved that I would go on writing, quote unquote. What I couldn't know, was that I would feel compelled to go on, even if what I wrote received no praise and had no special effect on anyone other than myself. It soon developed that writing became central to my life. That is, I found that when I sat down to write, the me who entertained a myriad of anxieties and insecurities seemed to disappear. There at the desk, with a piece of paper in front of me, my fingers now on a keyboard, wholly absorbed by the effort to order my thoughts, I felt safe, centered, untouchable, at once both excited and at peace, no longer distracted or unfocused or hungry for the things I didn't have. All that I needed was there in the room with me. I was there in the room with me. Nothing else in my life, neither love nor the promise of wealth or fame or even good health, would ever match the feeling of being alive to myself, real to myself, than writing gave me. Of course, it was great novels I was going to write, large, dramatic, world-changing novels that would make the reader love life more after my book had been read, and discovered soon enough that I had no talent for telling a tale that was concocted out of wholly imagined cloth. When I tried to write such a story, I soon found myself drowning in a muddle of verbiage from which I could make nothing of literary value emerge. The paragraphing was arbitrary, the sentences rang false, the words lay dead on the page. Writing a letter, I sounded more natural to myself. It seemed that it was only when the unsurrogated voice, the unsurrogated me, was narrating that the waves consented to part and I could walk on water, which is how it felt when the writing flowed. What to do? I was now well into my late 20s and hadn't a clue as to how I was going to write the great American novel when I couldn't make anything fictional come to life. Then I read Natalia Ginsburg's essay, My Vocation, and I saw the way forward. The essay traces Ginsburg's own apprenticeship as a writer. It tells of how a talented child dreams of writing prose extravaganzas, large and operatic, but hasn't the vaguest idea of how to approach the task of telling a story, as she doesn't really know what a story is. She only knows she's going to write magnificent sentences, and so she does. Sentences that describe sinister castles, kidnapped maidens, tyrannical fathers, threatening lovers. I didn't know anything about them beyond the words and phrases with which I described them. Next, she falls in love with phrases she thinks will chase down the ever-elusive story. And after that, characters, really puppets, on which to hang the story. Bit by bit, it comes clear that the essay itself, the one Ginsburg has written and we are reading, is a miniature Bildungsroman, wherein the author is teaching herself how to grow up and take her place in the world as a human being who is a writer. That is the story. Natalia Ginsburg, born Natalia Levy, was born in 1916 in Palermo, Sicily, but spent her youth in Turin, where her father taught science at the university. While the family was smart, cultured, and liberal, agitation reigned in the Levy household, as the father was a domestic tyrant, the mother a docile dreamer, and all 5 children given to melancholia. Natalia couldn't wait to get out. In 1938, at the age of 22, she married Leon Ginsburg, a Russian-born intellectual who wrote and taught, and by the time he and Natalia married, had become an anti-fascist activist. In 1941, the couple moved to a poor village in south central Italy, as Leon had been sentenced to internal exile. And there they had 3 children, whose birth proved so astonishing an experience to Natalia that she began to write the short pieces that were the genesis of the personal essays for which she would later be celebrated. In 1943, after the fall of Mussolini, the Ginsburgs decided it was safe to move back to Rome, a miscalculation for which they would pay dearly. Within 20 days of their arrival in the city, Leon was arrested and taken off to a military prison, where he was put to death. For Natalia, life itself had now accumulated with head-spinning rapidity, and a new kind of need to write came on full force. With it, there also arrived a sense of clarity that shocked her writing into authenticity. The trick she saw was to pay strict attention to one's actual experience and then find a way to make the writing accommodate it. In other words, you'll remember she began by wanting to write these fairy tales, making up stories from out of nowhere that had nothing to do with herself or her life. Now, with the war, with the death of her husband, with these children to support, she suddenly realizes she has to pay attention to her actual experience. Out of this precious insight, Ginsberg carved the brilliantly minimalist style that was to be ever after hers, a style she shared with nearly every European writer whose apprenticeship was the Second World War. In 1961, Ginsberg published a novel. Yes, she had taught herself to write fiction, called Voices in the Evening. This book opens with two women, a mother and a daughter, walking. One narrates, the other talks. The sentences pile up, one on one, casual to the point of disconnect. And here are the sentences. My mother said, I feel a kind of lump in my throat. My mother said, what a fine head of hair the general has at that age. She said, did you notice how ugly the dog has become? However, did the new doctor discover that I have high blood pressure? It has always been low with me, always. These banalities continue, both in speech and in narration. I remember thinking as I read, who are these people? What are they about? The speech is tiresome, their situation dull. Why should I care? The second time I read the novel, I realized these people were actually saying and doing startling things to themselves and one another. But the tone of voice that overlay the narration, hazy, dreamlike, almost anesthetized, was obscuring the action. And then it hit me. All this was taking place just after the Second World War. The war was the drain, the gap, the terrible lassitude at the center of a remarkable novel being written by a writer working out of an acute sense of the poetry at the heart of human catastrophe. It was the Ginsberg essays, however, coming apace with the novels as they did, that spoke most directly to me. In time, they seemed written for me. There in the essays, we had the creation of a narrating persona who, speaking out of the same interiority that informed the fiction, adopted a tone and vantage point sufficiently different that it lent a modernist distinction to the classic art of making metaphor out of nonfiction prose. As I read these essays, even for the first time, I felt myself taking instruction from a master teacher, showing me how to become the writer I had it in me to be. Among my early favorites was the well-known He and I, an essay that makes literary use of Ginsberg's life with her second husband. On the surface, a bold and amusing laundry list of marital differences. At its core, the piece is a tour de force demonstration of what it actually means to live with the circumstantial decisions that push us around most of our lives. Looking hard at one of the most taken for granted experiences in life, marriage, historically beloved, ceremonially worshipped, more often than not stumbled into, and then ever after endured, we see the narrator trying to untangle the knot of a pair of adversarial personalities, hers and her husband's, glued together in a situation that can seem as though it is being inflicted on the narrator alone. It's him who is causing all the damage. Only gradually does she come to see how complicit she is in this unholy alliance. At one point, she observes that while she has long been holding her husband to account for bullying her with his ever-exploding temper, she has only just now realized that while he yells, she nags. If I once find out that he has made a mistake, I tell him so over and over again until he is exasperated. It dawns on her that the shouting and the nagging together form a dynamic that feeds the ambivalence that ensures the irritations that characterize the relationship. It is the discovery of her own contribution to this disastrous intimacy that holds the narrator's attention and brings the essay to a point of startling arrival. Extraordinary when one comes to think about it, the compelling need to bend ourselves out of shape, rationalize trade-offs of an incredible variety, endure a lifetime of intermingled pleasure and pain, all in order to not be alone. That is marriage. The reader's eyes widen as the starkness of the double bind sinks in. For me, the narrator's discovery in He and I of her own part in the complexity being explored was key. I experienced it as the organizing principle behind the piece, the element that gave a dimension and structure, lifted it into the realm of dramatic writing. With this illumination came the one lesson I needed to advance my own apprenticeship. In fiction, a cast of characters is put to work, some of whom speak for the author, some against. Allow them all their way, and the writer achieves a dynamic. In nonfiction, the writer has only one's own unsurrogated self to work with. So it is the other in oneself that the writer must seek and find in order to achieve the necessary dynamic. Inevitably, the piece builds only when the narrator is involved, not in confession, excuse me, but in self-investigation, self-implication, actually, to make vital use of one's own part in the situation. That is, one's own frightened or cowardly or self-deceived part. That is to provide the essay with narrative tension. This insight was Natalia Ginsburg's great gift to my own working life, central to the education I needed to pursue the writing that I was not only best suited for, but could approach with the same regard for shaping a piece of experience through the personal essay that a fiction writer assumes when intent on exploring the inner life of the characters in a novel or a short story. Ginsburg's abiding concern, like that of any serious writer, has always been with identifying the conflicts within ourselves that keep us from acting decently toward one another. Like Montaigne, she is fearless about using herself as the specimen par excellence, tracing her own development away from the very faulty sense of human solidarity that she has seen at work in herself, even as she first began thinking seriously about the behavior of others. Taken all together, Ginsburg's essays can sometimes seem a veritable pilgrim's progress, as the narrator in these pieces explores the price to be paid for uncommon self-regard. The problem of our relationships with other human beings, she writes, lies at the center of our life. As soon as we become aware of this, that is, as soon as we clearly see it as a problem and no longer as the muddle of unhappiness, we start to look for its origins and to reconstruct its course throughout our whole life. Thus begins Human Relationships, an essay that achieves authority precisely because its narrative drive is provided by the narrator's brilliant investigation into her own emotional history. At the outset, she confides that it has taken her most of a lifetime to grasp the seriousness of what she is about to investigate. And certainly it will take the entire essay to make some large sense of it. We are primed then to accept that she will be thinking them out as she goes along. And oh yes, she will be speaking in the first person plural as she suspects that this is the voice that will best persuade her readers to see themselves in her findings. Starting with the emotional violence of the household in which she grew, Ginsberg remembers how angry she and her siblings became with the parents forever shouting at each other and the house in constant thrall to the father's outrageous mood swings. Self-protection required the cultivation of an emotional distance that, in time, took a heavy toll. In adolescence, she began to feel unreal to herself and soon grew into a stony-faced belligerent for whom everyone around her became unreal as well. Sometimes we stay alone in our room, she writes, for a whole afternoon, thinking, with a vague feeling of dizziness, we wonder whether the others really exist at all, or if it is we who have invented them. Isn't it possible that one day when we turn round and unexpectedly we shall find nothing, no one, and be left staring into emptiness? In time, this all-inclusive sense of spiritual remoteness allows her to indulge the perverse pleasure, of inflicting cruelty on others. The friend whom we have stopped seeing suffers on our account, she writes. We know this, but we don't feel sorry about it. It even gives us a kind of underhand pleasure, because if someone suffers on our account, it means that we, who for so long thought of ourselves as weak and insignificant, have in our hands the power to make someone suffer. And here we have it, the virtue of emotional unreality that will haunt her life and her work. She grows up, marries, has children, and then for the first time experiences naked anxiety. Quote, we never suspected that we could feel so bound to life by a chain of fear, of such heartrending tenderness. That's with a baby in the carriage. A crack develops in her armor. Then when devastation comes with the bombing of Italy, as it does with war and the loss of her young husband, death raining from the sky, children abandoned in the rubble, she quite unexpectedly finds herself taking part in a fellowship of suffering. Quote, we learn to ask for help from the first passerby, then to give help to the first passerby. This experience proves transformational. Now at last, she feels herself real because of, quote, that brief moment when it fell to our lot, hers, to live as though we had looked at the things of the world for the last time and found a point of equilibrium for our wavering life. From this moment on, this is still her speaking, Ginsberg. From this moment on, we could look at our neighbor with a gaze that would always be just and free, not the timid or contemptuous gaze of someone who, whenever he is with his neighbor, always asks himself if he is his master or his servant. Enough years pass that our narrator lives to see that what goes around comes around, and her wisdom, as well as her essay, is completed. Quote, now we are so adult that our adolescent children have already started to look at us with eyes of stone. You will remember how she looked at her parents with eyes of stone. We are upset by it and we complain about it, even though by now we know how the long chain of human relationships unwinds in its long necessary parabola. And though we know all the long road we have to travel down in order to arrive at the point where we have a little compassion. That's all this has all been heading for. Just that discovery with all this experience that one is living in order to become enough of a human being to have a drop of compassion. When you think about it, the genius of it is really just marvelous. Ah, those eyes of stone. Family Sayings is the memoir Ginsberg wrote at the age of 47 when she felt sufficiently in command of her art to do justice to the story she still wanted to tell, from whence come those eyes of stone. When I was a little girl at home, her memoir begins, if one of us children upset a glass at table or dropped a knife, my father's voice bellowed, behave yourself. If we soaked our bread in the gravy, he cried out, don't lick the plates, don't make messes and slops. We lived always with the nightmare of our father's outbursts of fury, which exploded unexpectedly and often for the pettiest reason. A pair of shoes that could not be found, a book out of its proper place, a light bulb gone, dinner slightly late. The volatile father, a madly discontented man with a hair-trigger temper, roars through the memoir, issuing arbitrary commands. Sit up straight. Don't get into conversations with strangers in a train or on the street. Don't take off your shoes in the sitting room or warm your feet at the stove. Don't complain of thirst, fatigue, or sore feet while walking in the mountains. For no apparent reason other than an almost demented need to exercise power over his beaten down wife and children, he makes these demands. Throughout the book, we never see him as anything other than the sum of his disabilities, a domestic despot responsible for an entire group of people wandering through the years, imprisoned within themselves, intent only on surviving the anxiety felt in the father's presence, or equally the relief felt in his absence. The mother, in her turn, having been driven into childlike dippiness, lives inside a pair of blinders, looking neither to the left nor the right, only straight ahead into whatever small pleasure is available to her, most often the one she gets from being with her sons. Isn't Gino handsome, my mother would say. Isn't Gino nice? My Ginetto. The one thing I really care about is my sons. This she tells her daughter. I only have fun with my sons. Which leaves Natalia, she of the increasingly stone-faced demeanor, standing in a place within herself, not quite alienated, but definitely not grounded. Quite casually, she lets us know that she is the one child for whom the mother feels affection, but almost no intimacy. In the early days of my sister Paula's marriage, my mother cried a lot because she no longer had her at home. There was a great bond between them, and they always had a great deal to say to each other. As for herself, she confides, the mother was not jealous of my friends, did not suffer a cry over my marriage, nor did she mind my leaving home, partly because, as she used to say, I never unwound with her. Neither, it seems, did any of her four siblings, who remain as opaque to one another, indifferent and aloof in adulthood as they apparently were in childhood. When they meet as grown-ups, all they have in common is some grim amusement over the shared past. We have only to say, we did not come to Bergamo for a picnic, for us to pick up in a moment our old intimacy and our childhood and youth. Some expression like that sends them back into childhood, linked indissolubly with these words and phrases. With the novels, we know that the story is one of ordinary lives caught inside a devastated culture trying to pick up the pieces. With the memoir, the devastated culture is the family itself, rather than the time in which it is living. But in both cases, the protagonist is seen wandering in an emotional desert that lends the writing its surreal quality. To drive home the point, the memoir is filled with the kind of disjointed paragraphing that marks the modernist novel. It's the tone of voice that does it, the tone, the odd place in which the narrator seems to be standing, and the even odder angle of vision from which she views her own psychological development. The one that tells me Ginsberg is writing to let me know that she too is a stranger to herself. The end. Okay. Oh.
Yeah, sorry. No, it's okay. I had problems with the audio.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you for reading that chapter. I would say it's my favorite from the book. I have the same than you.
I'm so glad. Me too.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I will make you like 2 or 3 questions, and I will try to make you different questions from the ones that...
Great.
Because I know that you've been giving interviews like crazy all these past weeks, so I will try to ask you some other things. Well, in Unfinished Business, you say that my vocation was the essay that helped you find your literary voice. In that text, Ginsburg says some terrible things about writing. Like, for example, my vocation has always rejected me. It does not want to know about me. Because this vocation is never a consolation or a way of passing the time. It is not a companion. This vocation is a master who is able to beat us till the blood flows. I would say that perhaps you yourself also seem to have a complicated relationship with writing, from what I can tell. I mean, it seems that it's not an entirely happy process until you feel you have found the right path. But maybe I'm wrong. So the question is, how would you, I don't know, how would you describe? Yeah, so, the question would be, how would you describe your relationship with writing and suffering?
Oh, writing and suffering.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you why we suffer. Ginsburg, me, every writer. Thinking is the hardest thing in the world. There is nothing harder than thinking. And we all hate to do it. And we all try very hard to avoid it. And when you realize that you've committed your life to thinking, and that you have your thoughts, they have to get it right, that you're making a shape and art out of thinking, it's horrifying. And you know that you're in for, it's a very lonely, boring life, writing. Really, right? I mean, and you're stuck there in the room, with these thoughts that you can't bring under control, that you need desperately to bring into shape. Your job is to shape a piece of experience through words. And that is the hardest thing in the world. Now, she describes it one way. I would say that when she says, my vocation is not interested in me, what she means is that she is never going to make herself the subject of a piece. She is always going to use herself to write the piece. I learned the same thing. I started as a personal journalist, what we used to call personal journalism, in the 1970s and 80s. And I learned through personal journalism that the idea that I had to find the right balance between using myself and unpacking the experience, the experience out there, the cultural or political experience. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is what she taught me to recognize. I didn't know that was the job until I read her. And then I understood my relation to this kind of writing. And that what my job was to continuously weigh how much I spoke about myself against how much the subject demanded. And I always teach my students that. I from the beginning, I've always told my students, your feelings are not a subject. Your feelings are a tool, an instrument, a way in. But you can't forget what it is that you're shaping, what the experience is. That's a personal essay or a memoir, or that's how a nonfiction writer, I believe, should function.
Yeah,
She taught me. She just made me see it. Yeah.
No, I mentioned that in my text because I think it's really important to have that clear, because when people write in first person, they think they are the subject, I mean, their feelings. And we see that a lot even in journalism, that they get involved and say, I like your book so much. But we're not interested in that. So I think it's a very important thing to teach. Yeah.
Right.
In that essay, Ginsburg says that when she started writing, she wanted to sound like a man, until she understood she could also be a good writer, writing from a woman's perspective. This reflection made me think of the time when you realized that a woman, just like a man, could and should take her brain seriously too. So the question is, how much did the discovery of feminism change your writing back in the 70s?
Well, it didn't change my writing. It gave me my writing. Until then, I acted like a girl, like an adolescent who I didn't hold myself to account. I didn't discipline myself. I didn't write regularly. I didn't hold myself like a professional. But feminism taught me that if just as I said, I realized women were not taught to take their brains seriously. It was what I wanted more than anything in the world. I came to want that more than anything in the world. More than marriage, more than motherhood, more than money, wealth, fame, anything. I wanted to be able to think well and write well. I wrote a book on women in science in 1980, and in that book, I had a subject. One of the scientists was a woman who went back to school after 2 failed marriages, a lot of children. She'd been very beautiful, and she traded on her beauty all her life. Now she was close to 50, and she was very unhappy. And she accidentally took a course in biology and discovered that she had a talent for it. And at that age, she enrolled in a PhD program and became a scientist. And when I asked her why this was so urgent for her, she said, all my life, when I've been asked what I think, I have said, or when I've been asked my opinion, I have said, I feel. She said, I went back to school because I wanted to say, I think.
And that's something that we still have to learn, because we still say, I feel, and it's something that we relate to women in general. We say, I feel like, and it's no, I think. We have to teach ourselves to say, I think, I know.
Go do it right now.
Yeah. And you say it also feminism changed your way of read, because feminism taught you to reread culture. You were reading everything differently, even the books that you loved, which is something that we find in this book. So I think that's also an interesting story. I mean, an interesting idea, I want to say. But I will pass to another subject because we have just 3 questions. So my last question will be, the relationship that you have with your personal library is not only that of possession. Books are charged with personal history. And just as it happens with photos, going back to them allows you to go back in time and return to the moments in which those books were read. Every personal library is also a kind of biography, isn't it? So I wonder if Unfinished Business could be read like that, like a sort of autobiography.
Oh, yeah, I think so. In fact, I was not going to include anything personal, but my editor insisted that I begin to see my journey through these books in a personal way. And I was grateful in the end that she made me do that, because it was far more interesting to and this was a task for personal journalism. It was an interesting task for me to use myself properly, just enough of myself in it to show how books stay in your life throughout the changes in your own life. And if I had not been willing to make something of a memoir of the book, I wouldn't have gotten that. But again, as I say, I did do it. And I'm glad I did it because it does what I think it does what it should do. It shows you how the relation between books and a life are intimate, and it's as if it's always a special kind of friendship that is constantly changing, as a friendship that survives, a good friendship, a friendship that goes with the years, a friendship that survives the years. And that's what writing this book did for me. It showed me that. And yes, in that sense, it is all autobiographical. Yeah. Our relation to reading is definitely autobiographical.
Mm-hmm. And Diego?
What's he doing?
He's coming.
Aquí estoy.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Queridas Evelyn, querida Vivian, muchas gracias por la presentación, por la lectura. Vivian, thank you very much for participating to the Cátedra Abierta Roberto Bolaño. Evelyn, por las preguntas, por la presentación tan cuidadosa. Muchas gracias al público que nos estuvo viendo atentamente. Realmente ha sido un lujo contar con Vivian, aunque sea a la distancia, ¿no? Digo, Vivian, we are very happy. It's an honor to listen to you. And I wish one day you could come to Chile.
I wish you could come to New York. Why don't you come to New York?
Yeah.
También, ¿por qué no? Pues esa sería la otra opción, ¿no? No, muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Vivian.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Evelyn. Estuvo increíble y muchas gracias a todo el público que nos vio, como les digo. Así que nada, cariños, y ya nos encontraremos en una nueva Cátedra Abierta Roberto Bolaño. Así que nos vemos y los mejores deseos para todos. Okay, que estén muy bien.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you, Evelyn. Evelyn, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You did really good.
Thank you.